G'day everyone, as it says and we've talked about, my name's Aaron. I'm going to today talk about CSS Grid. So it's going to be a high level overview of CSS Grid and hopefully we'll get you excited about using it eventually within the website itself. So a bit about me, I'm a front-end developer that works within a team what's called Spacely. So we're kind of like an Airbnb for short-term desks and offices like that. We sit within REA Group itself, so it's cool kind of little startup within that itself. Going into CSS Grid, so CSS Who. So hands up, first of all, who's actually using Flexbox as in right now inside the website, inside production? Cool, that's pretty good. And who's actually using Grid inside their actual websites in production and have experimented with it? Okay, Ben. So it's interesting. So hopefully today maybe we're getting people more excited and hopefully using it more. It's going to be interesting to think. Hopefully we can get into our websites and uplift it that way. So CSS Grid in itself is kind of like a new thing that it kind of coincides with what we do now with Flexbox. It's supposed to kind of coexist. It's not supposed to replace. And it's around a layout tool that'll help us present our content on the internet itself. So you can think of it as a two-dimensional layout. So if you think about how Flexbox, you can reorder things left to right, or if you change the axis top to bottom. But you can only really do that within that one axis. What kind of Grid gives us is the ability to completely move things around on multiple axes, which is really, really interesting. And it's kind of it's a mind brain. It's a really confusing thing to kind of talk about initially, but you'll kind of see some cool examples coming out. So going to give you an example of a website here. Like this is a pretty standard website header with a main. We have a sidebar and a footer. All these diagrams are actually pulled from the CSS Tricks, kind of the complete guide to Grid, which is a really great resource. I definitely recommend reading it. Very similar to the Flexbox guide that I use constantly. Every day I have to look it up just to kind of remember what I actually have to do to kind of write a line or how to get things working. So definitely look into that. So taking this website here, how would we build this in Grid? And it's kind of a really interesting concept. There's actually multiple ways to build out a grid on a website itself. So firstly, we set up a grid container, which I'll show you later on how to do. But there's another way we can actually set up areas within that. It's actually, using classes and using a new property called grid area to assign certain sections of the actual page itself. So we say grid areas, a header and whatnot to item A. We can then use that class anywhere we want and actually redefine kind of where the DOM is sitting visually inside the actual page itself. So it's kind of the first thing to now separate layout from display and markup. So with Flexbox, you can reorder stuff, and that was kind of cool, but now you can actually change things around. It's really, really interesting concept to kind of move forward with. So kind of, however, there's the buts as well. So browser support is actually not the best. Currently, it's still getting pretty good though, and we'll go into the actual statistics later on. It's interesting that IE 10 and 11 were actually one of some of the first to support it. They actually did support it on a much older syntax, and it's very different to what we have today, but it's still interesting that they were actually the first to kind of run with it and go with it. So as it stands, it might be a bit hard to read on this thing here, on this projection, but most major browsers actually do support it, with Edge 16 coming now to support it. So about 66% of the users on the internet, according to Can I Use, is now actually able to use Grid. So it's kind of we're getting there quite much faster than I thought we would. So Flexbox took the extra time, but Grid seems to kind of finally come in, and we should actually start seeing much more of a usage within our website itself. And then prior to like Chrome 57 and with Firefox, I think in a rough area in there, you have to actually set a flag, which is really interesting to kind of turn them on, but not anymore. It's all good now. So briefly, before we go into a little live coding demo, that's going to be interesting to see how we go. We did amazing before, so we'll see if I can keep going with that. We're going to go over some basic terminology of what CSS Grid kind of uses and runs with. So it's kind of very similar to Flexbox in that you have a container and you have a parent, and then you also have children, which are called a flex items, or in this case, grid items. But for me, it was about 100 times more complexity in terms of terminology. It's a lot more. It's interesting that the grid specification of the spec itself started, if not before Flexbox, around the same time as Flexbox, but it took so much longer to mature to get to the browser just because it's so much more complex. So for me, I took a while to kind of get into Flexbox, but even longer with Grid itself. So some terminology that you may see and crop up, just to kind of give you an overview. So a grid line is just almost like a gutter, vertically or horizontally between an actual kind of grid cell itself. You'll see a grid track, which is a kind of, again, a horizontal or a vertical row of cells between two grid lines. We have a grid cell. We have a grid area, which is kind of what we saw before when we actually assigning the header, the footer, the side content. And finally, we have a subgrid. So it's kind of similar to how in Flexbox you can allow a flex item to also be a flex parent and go forward. Within this case, a subgrid, you actually specifically have to say display subgrid rather than display grid itself, which is an interesting kind of call out. And quickly, we'll go into some grid facts before we get into the demo. So the grid areas that we saw before, they're actually not at risk of ever overlapping content with us. You can't have content that somehow spills across into the next area, just purely for the way that it actually kind of works and it's structured in that way. But it is, however, possible to overlay areas. So you can actually have stacking and kind of layers of actual areas themselves, which, again, is really interesting to kind of see how that works in the real world. And kind of as mentioned before, it's kind of Flexbox can reorder components in a single row, which is kind of cute. But again, Grid can do this on any vertical axis or horizontal axis at once. So you can literally have a footer that is, you write it first in your DOM and it's just displayed at the bottom. And you can have a sidebar here and you can mix things around. So it's going to come with a really interesting set of like how to debug this now. Like suddenly this div's here on the screen, but I've actually written it down here. And it's just like, how do you get around that? It's going to be interesting to see how we can also play with screen readers. So screen readers start reading the content from top to bottom. And if we've just changed things around, how is it going to work with that? So it'd be really interesting to see how we tackle these issues, but it also can be benefits as well. So hoisting content that makes sense, like the content of the body of the page, up to the very top of the DOM and move things like the navigation, which might not be as important further down. So to me, I guess this is probably the biggest mind-blowing thing, like separating content and DOM from the actual layer itself. And you might also see FI units. So if you're kind of used to or know of the flex grow and the flex shrink units, it's very similar to that. It's a fractional unit of available space. So if you do see that, it's just a symbol of that, just a number in that case. And I guess it's now demo time. So I'm going to pop open CodePen here. I do have a cheat sheet of actually the CSS inside the JavaScript file if I need. So hopefully it'll go right. But what I have here to kind of give you an overview, I have set up a basic kind of structure of container with a whole bunch of child elements within it. I have footer, header, main, and aside. Do notice that the footer is actually declared first. I actually chucked it right at the top here. And also I have some styles coming from somewhere else, just to let you know, just so you don't get too concerned about how all the styles come in. So that's basically it. So what we're going to do is build out a really simple grid system that's responsive, somewhat responsive, and within this. And we'll see how we go. So first off, similar to Flexbox, you just want to set on a display grid in this case, and then from that, nothing happens. Like it just sits there. You might see some refresh, but it basically does nothing itself. So now we need to actually assign these kind of contents to actual areas. And if I remember correctly, I think it's just grid area, and we'll just continue ahead and put a header here, and we'll go through and do the rest as well. So. Grid area, and you'll notice one by one they'll kind of start popping off and going crazy and moving around and I don't know, doing things they shouldn't do, but we'll see how we go. This is much harder to type, I thought. So once we've done this, in theory we should just see it all collapse in. So this is actually one way to display grid. Like I said, it's kind of complex. There's a few different ways to kind of build up these grid areas themselves. So. And that's kind of it, right? That's our website now. Let's see why it's doing this and what we can do better. So they have this really weird syntax, which I looked at it and I was like, what is this trying to do? It's a magical syntax, and if I can remember it correctly, I've kind of forgotten the name of it. It is the grid template area, the kind of property itself, and this is absolutely amazing. It's just mind-boggling. So if I want a 3x3 grid of area, so I want a header to be across all three, so header, 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 and then I want my main content to be on the first two on that one, and then having a side column. You literally just type in it as a string, like header, header, header. Now this could be emojis, it could be whatever you want, and now you just suddenly have a header that spans the entire way. Now it's a bit mucked up because we haven't specified the other ones just yet, so I'll just pop this to a new row, pop in a new one. In this case, we'll put on main twice, and then we'll put on the aside here, and then lastly we'll just put the footer across the entire lot, and that is it. Like that is strange syntax, and that is so crazy that that works. That's amazing. Now, look, it's kind of hard to see. We can actually add a grid gap. Now, if anyone's worked with kind of like a large-scale grid system and you've tried to do like gutters and columns and things like that, that is a nightmare to do. And you're doing like negative margins and crazy things like that. Now, with this thing, you could just chuck on that, and if I've done it right, boom, there we go. Got gutters vertically, horizontally centered. It's just amazing, and you can change this in and out however we want, and it's really, really cool and amazing to do that. I just like that. That was me, like, wow, like that's cool. But what's also cool, again, this is just CSS. We can also do media queries. So you can just chuck on, and based on this, we can chuck in another thing, and we can change this entire block depending on if it want on a smaller device. So in this case, how about I want my footer to become the side thing now. So we'll just chuck the footer here, and we'll make this. Yeah, sure, why not? And we'll make this do this. And in theory, if that works, and just because it's in full screen, it's not going to let me shrink it in. But in theory, if I just do that and move it in, now we have this footer now suddenly collapsing and pushing up to the right itself, and it's just changed its entire orientation. We've just moved things around in complete nonsense in terms of like you would not be able to do this in Flexbox in an easy manner. It means that we don't have to rewrite things. We don't have to display none on this version and open it up here, and it's really cool. It's worth noting that it does only work within like kind of like squares or rectangle things. You can't have an element bend a corner and things like that. That's unfortunately, we don't have that just yet. Maybe the new spec will have that, but it's just kind of very static, kind of like horizontally and vertically slices for now. But that's kind of the demo for now. I'll keep going with the rest of it, and there's a tiny bit left. So there's a bit more, and I've kind of alluded to it, there's a bit more complexity around kind of grid itself. So we just saw how I set up the kind of grid areas by typing header, header, header. There's actually another way to do this as well, and that's actually set up the template columns and rows in another manner. So before I kind of wrote 3 columns out, but here we can actually specify a finite amount. You can use mixed units, you can order, you can use pixels, and you can do whatever. And then from there, we can actually say we want item A to start at 2 and then end at 5. And again, you can use mixed units. You can use 5 as a letter, like word 5, or you can use it as a number, and you can start at row 1 and do things like that. And so we can build up the kind of the grid areas like item A here. And this is how you can see we can now overlay areas and lap areas and create this layer. So you can have multiple areas stacking on top of each other and doing different things, and it's kind of really cool within that. But that's basically it. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully you've now got a glimpse of what kind of CSS Grid is, and hopefully we'll start seeing it more and more in use, and it'll be great to see how we kind of tackle the two-dimensional layout system. So yeah, thank you.